In just 73 seconds, $127 billion vanished from parliamentary oversight. Ursula von der Leyen didn't wait for diplomatic protocols. She walked directly to the Hungarian delegation's table and placed a single document marked Article 7, Final Warning, in front of Viktor Orban. The cameras zoomed in. The European Parliament held its breath. What did the Commission President just trigger that would make her own institutional power crumble within the hour? I'm watching this unfold from the press gallery in Strasbourg, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, this is the moment the European Union's power structure began eating itself alive. At exactly 2:47 p.m. Central European Time, Ursula von der Leyen made what historians will call the most catastrophic tactical error in modern EU politics. She decided to go nuclear against Viktor Orban, not behind closed doors, not through diplomatic channels, live, on camera, in front of 705 members of the European Parliament. The setup was perfect for institutional theater. Von der Leyen entered the chamber like someone who believed the full weight of Brussels bureaucracy was behind her. Her chief of staff, Björn Seibert, carried a leather portfolio containing what we now know were the preliminary findings of the Article 7 procedure against Hungary. This wasn't supposed to be a public execution. It was meant to be a private intimidation. But Orban was ready. He had been waiting for this moment for months. The Hungarian Prime Minister sat with the calm of someone who had already seen the cards. His delegation occupied the center-right section, surrounded by members of the Patriots for Europe group. Poland's representatives flanked him on the left. Italy's Lega members provided backup on the right. This wasn't just one man against the machine. This was a coordinated ambush. Von der Leyen approached the podium at 2:49 p.m. Her opening statement was textbook Commission rhetoric, measured, technical, clothed in legal language about rule of law mechanisms and budgetary compliance frameworks. She spoke for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds about Hungary's alleged violations of EU values. Then she made the fatal mistake. Instead of staying behind the podium's protective barrier of institutional authority, she stepped down. She walked directly into the parliamentary floor. She approached Orban's seat with the Article 7 document in her hand and said, loud enough for the microphones to catch, "Mr. Prime Minister, you have 30 days to respond to these charges, or Hungary faces suspension of voting rights." The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. Orban didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply smiled and reached into his own briefcase. What he pulled out was a thick manila folder marked with the seal of the Hungarian Ministry of Justice. Inside, as we would discover in the next 12 minutes, were documents that would destroy not just von der Leyen's political career, but the entire legitimacy of the European Commission's financial oversight. "Madam President," Orban said, his English crisp and deliberate, "before we discuss Hungary's compliance, perhaps you could explain to this Parliament where the $127 billion from the Recovery and Resilience Facility actually went." The blood drained from von der Leyen's face. She knew immediately what he was referring to. We all did, if we'd been paying attention. For months, financial journalists across Europe had been tracking irregularities in the RRF disbursements. Money allocated for green energy infrastructure in Eastern Europe had somehow found its way into consultancy contracts with firms that had no track record in renewable technology. The paper trail led through Luxembourg shell companies, Delaware incorporations, and ultimately to a web of advisory firms with very familiar names on their boards of directors. But Orban had the receipts. He opened the folder and began reading transaction codes. Wire transfer reference EUX 4471LX dated March 15, 2025 for $840 million, supposedly earmarked for Hungarian solar farms, but actually transferred to Greenstrat Consulting Delaware. Transfer code EUX 4472LUX dated March 22, 2025 for $1.2 billion, ostensibly for Polish wind infrastructure, but routed through Sustainable Futures Advisory Luxembourg. The pattern was devastating. Every major RRF disbursement over the past 8 months had been diverted through the same network of consulting firms, and Orban had the banking records to prove it. Von der Leyen tried to interrupt. "Mr. Prime Minister, these are serious allegations that require proper investigation through the appropriate channels?" Orban cut her off. "You mean the same channels that approved these transactions? The same budgetary control committee that signed off on every single diversion?" He stood up now, holding a different document. This one bore the official letterhead of the European Court of Auditors. This is a preliminary report from the ECA, completed just yesterday. It confirms that $127 billion in RRF funds cannot be accounted for through standard procurement procedures. The money exists on paper. The projects do not exist in reality. The parliament erupted, not in the usual controlled chaos of political theater, but in genuine panic. MEPs were frantically calling their assistants. The Greens, normally von der Leyen's most reliable allies, sat in stunned silence. The EPP group looked like they were witnessing a family murder. But Orban wasn't finished. He pulled out a third document, this one stamped with confidential eyes-only markings. "And this," he said, his voice now carrying across the chamber without amplification, "is an internal commission email dated February 3, 2025, in which President von der Leyen personally approves the streamlined procurement process for RRF disbursements, a process that bypassed parliamentary oversight, eliminated competitive bidding, and directed contracts to pre-selected consultancy networks." The email printout was too far away for the cameras to capture the details, but Orban read key excerpts aloud. "Given the urgency of climate transition targets, normal procurement delays are unacceptable. Authorize direct contracting with established advisory partners to ensure rapid deployment of allocated funds." Von der Leyen's hands were shaking now. She gripped the document table for support. In the span of 8 minutes, she had gone from prosecutor to defendant. Furthermore, Orban continued, his tone now that of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, "This parliament should be aware that Greenstrat Consulting Delaware lists among its board of advisors Dr. Heiko von der Leyen, son of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, a detail that was somehow omitted from the conflict of interest declarations filed with the Ethics Committee." The chamber exploded. Even the usually disciplined German MEPs from von der Leyen's own party were shouting for clarification. The French delegation looked mortified. The Italian representatives were calling for immediate suspension of the session. I watched from the press gallery as von der Leyen's entire power structure collapsed in real time. Her chief of staff was on the phone, presumably with crisis management lawyers. Her security detail moved closer, not because of physical threats, but because the political threats were now existential. At 3:03 p.m., exactly 16 minutes after she had approached Orban with what she thought was a killing blow, Ursula von der Leyen did something unprecedented in the history of the European Commission. She walked out of the parliamentary chamber without finishing her presentation. No statement to the press, no rebuttal to the allegations, no attempt at damage control. She simply gathered her files, nodded to her security team, and exited through the side door reserved for emergency evacuations. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within 30 minutes, the European People's Party had called an emergency meeting. Within an hour, the Budgetary Control Committee had announced a formal investigation into RRF disbursements. By 5 p.m., 3 major European newspapers had received anonymous leaks of the banking documents Orban had referenced. The markets reacted with savage efficiency. The euro dropped 1.3% against the dollar within hours. European Commission bonds saw their first negative trading day in 18 months. The DAX and CAC 40 indices both closed down more than 2%, with energy sector stocks leading the decline as investors realized that the entire green transition funding mechanism might be compromised. But the real damage wasn't financial. It was institutional. For the first time in the European Union's history, a Commission president had been publicly exposed as potentially corrupt by a member state she was trying to discipline. The power dynamic had inverted completely. Orban had played the long game perfectly. For months, he had endured lectures about rule of law and democratic backsliding. He had absorbed criticism about judicial independence and press freedom, all while quietly gathering evidence that the institution lecturing him was itself captured by private interests. The irony was devastating. The European Commission, which had spent years accusing Hungary and Poland of undermining EU values, had been systematically looting the EU budget through exactly the kind of crony capitalism it claimed to oppose. By evening, the political implications were clear. Von der Leyen's presidency was finished. The Article 7 procedure against Hungary was dead. The entire Recovery and Resilience Facility would need to be audited from scratch. And Viktor Orban had emerged as the unlikely champion of EU financial transparency. Social media exploded with RRF scandal and Orban was right trending across European platforms. TikTok videos breaking down the consulting firm connections reached millions of views within hours. Even traditionally pro-EU publications like Politico Europe were running headlines like "The Commission's $127 billion problem." The establishment media tried damage control, focusing on Orban's authoritarian tactics and ambush politics. But the numbers didn't lie. The documents were authentic. The banking records were verified. The conflict of interest was undeniable. 3 days later, as I write this, von der Leyen has still not held a press conference. The Commission's daily briefings have been cancelled. The European Parliament has demanded a full financial audit of all RRF disbursements since 2020. And Viktor Orban, the man Brussels spent years trying to marginalize, has become the de facto leader of EU budget oversight reform. The lesson is brutal but clear. In politics, never attack an enemy unless you're certain they don't have evidence of your own crimes. Von der Leyen thought she was wielding the sword of institutional authority. Instead, she had handed Orban the perfect opportunity to expose the rot at the heart of the European project. The European Union will survive this scandal, but it will emerge fundamentally changed. The age of technocratic immunity is over. The age of transparency through confrontation has begun, and Viktor Orban, the supposed destroyer of European values, may have just saved European democracy from itself. If this analysis changes how you see EU power dynamics, subscribe and hit the notification bell for updates as this story develops. The full implications of today's confrontation are still unfolding, and you won't want to miss what happens next. This presentation is fictionalized and serves analytical and educational purposes.